Welcome back to Robot Cantina. A cement mixer powered street legal go-kart with a Supercharger? What else do you need to know? Grab your coffee and donut and let's get going. Oh yeah, and don't forget to shave. Now, today I'm going to need you to be on your A game and pay attention. We got a lot to cover. So for the Supercharger experiment, we're going to use the spare 420-inch that we have in stock. This engine's brand new and has never been run, so we mounted it on one of our test stands and let it run for a few hours to break it in. Now this engine has a regular carburetor and a magneto ignition system. Both of those are necessary to break the engine in, but after we build it, it'll be set up with the Speeduino fuel injection that we've been running in our street legal go-kart since last summer. The Supercharger will certainly put a lot of stress on the engine, so we're going to reinforce it with an ARC billet connecting rod, along with stainless steel valves and some heavier valve springs. Of course, new gaskets and all the necessary stuff to put it back together. When we're done, it'll be ready for boost. Now speaking of boost, we'll also need to modify the stock piston rings, and for that we use this grinder thingy along with a feeler gauge, and we'll get back to that in a few minutes. But the first thing we need to do is strip this engine down to the bare block. Are you guys ready? Okay, so this is something I do, and it really bugs me when people mix up valve train components. Anyway, I like to keep all the parts together, so when I reassemble the engine, all the parts go back in the same location. On a brand new engine like this, I don't think it makes a difference, but it's good practice. So at this point, we can remove the last few components, and that is the piston and connecting rod. So the stock 420 rod looks pretty beefy, but we'll replace it anyway. Now check this out. I'm sure it makes sense to whoever engineered this part, but look at how they remove material where both halves of the rod mate. I reckon this is to help with the lubrication or something. The ARC rod, on the other hand, this is a piece of artwork. Now, ARC doesn't sponsor this channel, and I'm not obligated to say good things. I just feel the need to say something nice about a product that makes today's experiment possible. Without this rod, I think things would probably end rather quickly. Anyway, this rod has a little scoop to force the oil into the bearings. I don't know if that helps, but it's a nice feature for sure. Now this rod also uses automotive type bearing inserts, which is also a nice feature. So with the electronic fuel injection, we don't need the governor that's built into the engine, so theoretically we can remove this plastic governor gear. My only concern is this gear also serves another purpose because it flings oil around when it spins. Ultimately, I feel the plastic gear is a liability and has to be removed, so that's what we'll do. Now getting this gear off is difficult at best. I actually went over to Redbeard's channel and did some learning or something like that. The takeaway is, you have to bust the gear in many pieces to get it off. So fast forward a little bit, and we have the busted gear. This little clip is what holds the gear in place, and you pretty much have to demolish the gear to get it out. So let's take a look at the piston rings. So on a turbo or supercharged engine, the piston rings see a lot of heat, and from what I've read on the internet, it's good practice to open up the ring gap or else serious engine damage can result. The procedure requires first measuring the current ring gap and then applying a formula to calculate how much to grind off. The formula is different depending on what type of engine you're working on. For instance, a water-cooled engine is different from an air-cooled engine, and diesel engines are different as well. The prevailing thought is the piston rings see a lot of heat and can expand faster than the rest of the engine. If they expand too fast, well, the ring gap will close and the ring will bind and push outward, possibly seizing the engine, or something will get busted, in a bad way. So to avoid the issues of insufficient ring gap, we need to shave a few thousandths off the rings with this thingamajig. The camera guy decided to show up and lend us a hand, which was nice. Anyway, it takes several attempts to get the ring gap correct. The last part of this build is putting the cylinder head back together. Now, we're using brand new stainless steel valves and we'll need to lap them in. I like to use machinist blue when doing this. If the valves are lapped correctly, there should be no dye left on the contact points. It's a good way to detect problems early in the build. Lapping the valves requires a little bit of grit and you just smear it on the valve. This will help mate the valve to the seat for a perfect fit. Of course, you'll have to clean this stuff off when done or you'll have a bad day. Putting the valve springs back in takes a lot of effort. Fortunately, the store that sells the Predator engine also sells a cheapo valve spring compressor kit. You know, I never mentioned the store by name in any of my videos. Anyway, with the cylinder head complete, we can put the engine back together and install the Supercharger. So let's take a moment and talk about the Supercharger. For today's experiment, we're going to install an ASIN AMR300. Now that's a Roots type positive displacement 300cc supercharger. So what that means is, every time the supercharger makes one revolution, it'll pump 300 cc's of air. This type of supercharger differs from a turbo in that it offers instantaneous boost and doesn't need time to spool up. Or in other words, as soon as you floor the accelerator, you're making boost. And we want boost now, not a little bit later. So inevitably someone will ask, well, why don't you use a turbo? Well, originally we were going to use a turbo, but we don't have a reliable way to generate oil pressure that the turbo requires. And that is because our 420cc engine doesn't have an oil pump. And yeah, I'm aware that an electric oil pump could be used, but in my opinion, that's a little bit more than half-ass. Instead, we're going with the Supercharger because it has its own oil supply and doesn't need an oil pump. Of course, some would say that the newly released Predator 459 does have an oil pump, and yep, I'm aware of that. But today we have a Supercharger and a 420cc engine, so let's install the Supercharger and see what happens. Anyway, this is the 300cc variant, and there's also a 500cc Supercharger. Now these things can be purchased for less than $200 on various websites that sell things, so they're pretty easy to get if you want to experiment with one. So today we'll experiment with the AMR300, and by the end of the video, we'll see if this Supercharger works or what modifications we'll need to do in order to make it work better. But the only way we'll learn is to try and possibly fail. So here is the Supercharger. Now keep in mind these things are cheap because they're used and allegedly remanufactured. Now this one appears to have been cleaned up a little bit, but I'm not really sure it was actually rebuilt. It is what it is. Of course, there's the output side, and if we flip it over, there's the input. So that's something important to be aware of, and it should go without saying. So this shaft sticking out is for the drive pulley. Originally this came with a cast iron V-belt pulley, and that was probably fine, but we machined the pulley down to a flange to give us different pulley options. Plus, we wanted to use a flat belt instead of a V-belt. It's just a matter of preference, really. Now, the pulley we're using is from a Ford V6, and I believe it's a water pump pulley. Anyway, it's a starting point, and we may have to go with a smaller diameter pulley depending on how much boost we generate. Currently, we're starting off with a 1-to-1 ratio, and that's what the folks in the comment section suggested several episodes ago back in Season 1. Yeah, this Supercharger experiment has taken a while to get rolling. So a 1-to-1 ratio kind of makes sense, and that's why we went with it. Keep in mind, at wide open throttle, the Supercharger delivers a 300cc chunk of air every revolution, and in a perfect case, the engine can consume 420 cc's of air every 2 revolutions. So, theoretically, we have a surplus air, and that spells B-O-O-S-T. Now, I'm sure it's more complicated than that, but I feel it's a good starting point. So, if you would, take a moment and put down your best guess in the comment section whether this will make boost or not. So the pulley gets attached with a few fasteners for a secure fit. For the input flange, we took the plastic doohickey that the Supercharger came with and machined off the stub. Now we did this to save space because there ain't a lot of room under the hood of a Honda Insight. These cars were built to a minimum and as light and aerodynamic as possible. But inevitably some yahoo comes along with a get her done attitude and we can get stuff to fit. Well, most of the time. The jury's still out on the 670 V-twin. The throttle body mount on the input side of the supercharger was achieved by using a small block Chevy water neck. It's almost the perfect fit, and this custom part cost $20. The water neck has an O-ring on the flange side that makes an airtight seal once it's bolted up to the supercharger. The throttle body in itself is from an unknown motorcycle engine. Basically, I saw it on eBay and thought, well, this looks like it'll work, and since it came from overseas, the language barrier prevented me from getting any specific info on this part. So if anybody knows what this is from, let me know. The throttle position sensor that came with the throttle body had a weird connector on it, so once again I jumped on eBay and did some digging. I couldn't find the correct connector, but I did find a new TPS sensor from a Polaris Ranger 700. The Polaris TPS sensor has a short harness and a connector, so I ended up cutting off the connector from the harness and installing a generic connector. It works. For the output side of the supercharger, we used the water neck from an unknown car. Basically, I found this water neck laying on the ground at the pick and pull and snatched it up. A small block Chevy gasket seems to fit it perfectly, so it may be yet another Chevy part. The inlet air temperature sensor, or IAT, needs to sample the air temperature after the supercharger because the compressed air will get significantly hotter once it passes through the supercharger. So for the sensor, I used the standard GM type sensor, and to mount it, I used a 40mm aluminum radiator coolant hose joint. These joints are normally used to add additional coolant temperature sensors, but in our case, it was the right size for the induction pipes we're using, so it got repurposed. The injector housing we're using is again from an unknown type motorcycle engine. I'm not sure, but it looks like it's made from ABS plastic and may or may not be suitable for our application. Only time will tell. The O-ring pocket was eventually filled in with JB Weld, and the flange was sanded smooth so we could use a larger gasket. A little bit of fiddling went into this joint to produce an airtight seal. Of course, this is where the injector mounts, and this is the nipple where we connect the map sensor. So this little plastic manifold attaches to the 420 engine with this custom-built aluminum adapter. Again, everything's a tight fit with awkward angles, but in the end it all lined up. The last bit of the supercharger upgrade was finding the way to mount the drive pulley. For this we used a hub from Performance 670. This hub was originally intended to mount a drive shaft on the flywheel side of a 420 Predator engine, but with a little machining we were able to mate it up with a Ford water pump pulley. Not too shabby. So as you can see for this build, we tried to use a lot of off-the-shelf parts when possible, but there was a lot of fabrication involved to make this system compact so it would fit under the hood of the Honda inside and leave us room for possible future upgrades, like an intercooler or whatnot. Now this system may look huge on the bench, but like I said, this is how it all fits together when it's in the car. I say we fade to black, and in the next scene, we'll see if the engine will run with all this random stuff. Well, crap. A rookie mistake, I reckon, but the good news is the engine started and that was half the battle. So the problem's obvious once you wrap your head around what's going on. Since the throttle body is ahead of the supercharger, at idle when the engine generates vacuum, the induction hoses are collapsing. It doesn't matter how fast the supercharger spins at idle because the throttle body is choking off the air supply. We could spin the supercharger 10 times as fast, but at idle the throttle will still be closed and it wouldn't let in enough air to inflate the induction pipes. This appears to be an issue just at idle, and it makes sense once you put your mind to it. So there's many ways to fix this. I elected to reinforce the induction hoses with aluminum pipe. I sourced a few feet of aluminum tubing and cut it in sections to fit inside the flexible induction pipe. Each piece had to be cut to the exact size and then deburred on the lathe. It took some effort, but the end results kept the induction plumbing looking nice. Now I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, because in the time it took to get the aluminum pipe to modify the induction system, we went ahead and mounted the throttle body directly to the engine and bypassed the supercharger. We did this so the car could be driven and we could collect some data on the new throttle body. Long story even longer, while out driving we encountered yet another problem. This time it ended up being the brakes were not releasing all the way. Well, we ended up replacing the seals on the front calipers, and that made a huge difference. So here's something I noticed when bleeding the brakes. Let's see if you can spot it. Yeah, so this car has the calipers mounted in different locations. It turns out the driver's side of the car has the wrong spindle on it. A new one is on the way, but since it worked before, it'll work again and we'll run with it for now. When it rains, it pours. So with the induction plumbing reinforced, it was time to see if this thing would actually work. Let's take a look. Well, that's good enough for me. Keep in mind the engine's running on the previous tune and isn't set up for the supercharger yet, so it's running a little rough, but that's easily fixed. So this area here is part of the VE map that we needed to modify just to get the engine idle. Now the rest of the map is completely wrong, but for now, all I want is the engine idle. I'll deal with setting up the rest of the map later. So with the basics sorted out, it was time to rewrite all the maps for boost. Now, I ain't never done this before, so the basics are pull back on the ignition timing and add a little bit more fuel. We can fine-tune it after looking at some data log files, but for now we're running a safe tune. So the boost is still unknown, and for safety we'll put a fuel shutoff limit if we see boost above 150 kilopascals, or 7.2 psi. That should be plenty of overhead, because this thing will never make that much boost. Or will it? Well, I guess we shall see. I reckon it's time to get some data. So right away the car feels different. The throttle response is at a whole new level. I think we finally did something right. Now keep in mind the tune at this point is rough and we'll need to fine tune it as we do some basic testing. The minivan in front of me is my brother Duke and his wife Cheryl, and they pretty much have it easy today. Their only job is to be on standby in the event the engine explodes or something like that. Duke and Cheryl are the other half of the robot Cantina team, in case you're wondering. Anyway, give this video a thumbs up for Duke and Cheryl, otherwise I'm gonna fire them both. After about a half hour of data logging and tuning, we were ready to do some wide open acceleration runs. Well, if you recall, we previously set the fuel to cut off if the manifold pressure exceeded 150 kilopascals. So 150 kilopascals translates to 7.2 psi. I guess the supercharger actually works. Booyah! Just for giggles, we set the new limit to 175 kilopascals, or about 10.5 psi. That should be enough overhead to avoid fuel cutoff. Now let's try that again. Looking good. Now let's go ahead and look at some live data. So here's the rundown. The white is the RPM, red is the manifold pressure, and anything above 100 is boost. Green is the intake air temperature. Now obviously we ain't got an intercooler yet, so this is something to keep an eye on. And of course yellow is the throttle position sensor. For this test we're starting off in third gear and letting the CVT do all the work, and we'll take it all the way to 50 miles per hour. Okay, so we're almost ready, but I want to point out the throttle position trace. Normally we floor the accelerator and the TPS goes to 100% instantly. However, this time around we're easing into the throttle because too many unknowns, and it's better to be safe than sorry. This will affect our times, but by how much? We shall see. Not too shabby, all things considered. Now let's try this again, but this time we'll start off in 4th gear and take it all the way to 60 miles per hour. The beeping sounds you hear during the acceleration run marks the different speed levels. For instance, the first beep you hear is 30 miles per hour, the second is 40, then there's one at 50, and of course one at 60. And keep in mind on this run we also eased into the throttle. Alright, let's do it. So how'd we do? Well, starting off in 3rd gear and easing into the throttle with less than an ideal tune netted us 32.85 seconds to reach 50 miles per hour. So how does that compare to the previous times? Well, good question. Now this might surprise some folks, but the best time we previously recorded was 33.23 seconds. So we're about a half second faster. But keep in mind the car was severely handicapped, being this was its first outing with the Supercharger. I reckon it'll be easy to cut 5 to 10 seconds off this time, or not, depending on how much we exceed the design limitations of all this crap we put the car together with. It'll be interesting. The Supercharger generated a very respectable 7 psi of boost during the run, and we saw a peak at 10 psi right before it hit redline. Now we would be jumping for joy at 5 psi, and this was completely unexpected. So, did any of you folks guess correctly? Honestly, this was a tough call, and it's okay if you got it wrong. The intake air temp looks like it's going to be a problem, but I'm no expert. Anybody think it's time for an intercooler? Now these data plots have been simplified for the general audience, and of course there's a lot more going on that we also have to look at. Aside from the air temperature, the only real problem I can see here is the vacuum when the throttle is closed. Well, normally vacuum ain't a problem, but as others have commented before, the seals in the Supercharger may not be engineered for that much vacuum. So we have a few tricks we want to try. So the takeaway is, yes, the Supercharger works, and we ain't broke nothing yet. It was definitely a good day. So 0 to 60 when starting off in 4th gear, well that's a different story. You see, we've never done that before because previously there wasn't enough road to try this. It takes a long time when starting off in 4th gear. Today is of course a day of great surprises because this car didn't let us down. It didn't break, and it got us up to 60 miles per hour and less road than it takes to get a 747 off the ground. The Supercharger really shined on this one. 0 to 60 took 59 seconds, and for the metric crowd, that's less than a minute. That's pretty much meaningless without something to compare to, and the best we can show was it took 89 seconds to hit 60 when starting off in 3rd gear, but that's apples and oranges. But still, what about top speed? Well, we didn't push our luck, and that's something for another day. Now, do I think the car will go faster than the 70 mile per hour goal? Hell yeah, and we'll get there, but not today. We have some work to do with the tune and whatnot, and make some doohickeys and so forth, but we'll get there. Be sure to leave comments, and inevitably there'll be those who ask why I didn't do it this way or that way. Well, I did it my way along with the help from all those who leave comments, but I can't completely re-engineer on the fly to satisfy everybody. This channel doesn't have the resources like the Goon Squad, which I truly love to watch. Anyway, with the more subscribers, the more we can do. It's just that simple. So if you haven't subscribed already, please do so if you want to see a 420cc fuel-injected supercharged Hemi from a cement mixer get this Honda Insight up to 70 miles per hour. Until next time.
What are you going to make now? The video is over.
You'll see.
Oh, that is cool.
Come on, buddy. Let's go get some lunch.
Can we have motor oil?
It's engine oil, and yes, you can have some.